20 years after a cargo plane vanished into an Alaska snowfield. Mason Carter, a single father and independent aircraft engineer, was hired to assess the wreck before it was scrapped. Nobody believed the airframe could be saved, least of all Charlotte Hayes, the executive, who now owned the grounds where it sat. But Mason found the fuselage almost intact, and he began repairing the dead electrical system. When he restored power for one last test, a dust-covered radio flickered awake. A broken voice crackled through the static, calling his name, warning him never to let anyone find the recorder. If you want to know whose voice was calling Mason through that radio after 20 silent years, keep watching now. An unusually early thaw swept across the Alaska interior that spring, pulling back a blanket of ice that had covered the tail section of a twin-engine cargo plane for nearly 2 decades. The registration on the fuselage, weathered but legible, read N417HC. The aircraft had once belonged to a small regional freight carrier that folded not long after it disappeared. Official records claimed the plane lost contact during a post-maintenance test flight and was presumed to have gone down somewhere deep in the surrounding mountains. Search crews at the time had never pinpointed an exact location, and the case was closed within a single winter. In truth, the wreck rested less than a few miles from the old runway, tucked into a hollow that a slow-moving avalanche had sealed shut. Hayes Aeronautics had recently purchased the entire property, hangar and all, and Charlotte Hayes intended to clear the land for resale. A demolition crew already on site had written the aircraft off as scrap, nothing more than twisted aluminum, waiting to be hauled away. Mason Carter was brought in separately, hired as an independent engineer to confirm the wreck could be safely dismantled before the crew moved in with cutting torches. Charlotte drove out to the site herself, since the discovery of a long-lost aircraft carried insurance and legal questions no company wanted to ignore. She found Mason kneeling in the snow beside the landing gear, brushing frost away with a gloved hand, unhurried in a way that made the demolition foreman visibly impatient. She introduced herself and asked the only question that mattered to her that morning, whether there was anything on this wreck worth saving. Mason did not answer right away. He circled the fuselage slowly, studying the shape of the wing spars, the angle of the gear struts, the condition of the propellers still locked in place. Nothing about the wreckage matched what a high-speed impact should look like. The skin of the plane was dented but not torn. The landing gear was extended and locked, rather than crumpled beneath the body, and the cabin windows, though clouded with ice, were unbroken. He finally spoke, and his answer was not what Charlotte expected. He told her the plane had not crashed at all. She asked him what he meant, and he pointed toward the gear assembly, still standing firm in the snow. Someone had landed this aircraft on purpose, he said, and landed it well. Charlotte looked at the wreck again, seeing it differently now, and neither of them said much for a long moment after that. It was the first thread in a mystery that official paperwork had closed 20 years earlier without ever asking the right questions. The foreman grew restless, watching the two of them linger over rusted metal instead of signing off on the teardown, and he reminded Charlotte more than once that every hour spent standing around cost the company money it did not need to lose. Charlotte ignored him for the moment, more interested in the calm certainty in Mason's voice than in the schedule sitting on her clipboard. She had built her early career on reading people quickly, and nothing about this quiet engineer suggested he was exaggerating or performing for an audience. Mason walked the perimeter of the wreck one more time, noting how deliberately it had come to rest, nose slightly uphill, wings level, nothing about its final position suggesting chaos or panic. Whoever had been at the controls that night had fought to bring the aircraft down gently and largely succeeded, which raised a question neither the foreman nor the old case file seemed interested in answering. If the landing had gone well enough to leave the plane in this condition, why had no one ever come looking for it, and why had the story simply ended there? The demolition crew wanted to cut the wings and open the fuselage the very next morning, eager to finish the job and move on to the next contract. Mason objected before the first torch was even unpacked. He had spent the previous evening walking the length of the wreck with a flashlight, and what he found convinced him this was not an ordinary scrap job. The landing gear was still locked in the down position, exactly as it should be after a controlled touchdown, rather than a violent fall. The wings showed no signs of a high-force collision, and the propeller blades were bent only slightly, the kind of damage caused by a slow contact with snow rather than a crash into rock. The fuselage itself had not been torn open anywhere, and the cabin, once he cleared enough ice from the door, looked almost undisturbed inside. Taken together, the evidence pointed to one conclusion: that a pilot had brought this aircraft down under control during some kind of emergency, not lost it in open sky the way the old report claimed. Mason asked Charlotte for 48 hours before anyone touched the airframe again. Charlotte, mindful of the schedule and the cost of every delay, was reluctant to grant it. She had a buyer waiting on the land and no patience for a project stretching longer than planned. While she weighed the request, her phone rang, and on the other end was Jackson Reed, the company's longtime vice president, pressing her to have the wreck destroyed as quickly as possible because of what he called unnecessary liability exposure. The urgency in his voice struck Mason as strange the moment Charlotte repeated it to him. A 20-year-old aircraft heading for the scrapyard rarely provoked that kind of pressure from a company executive who was not even on site. Charlotte eventually relented and gave Mason his 2 days, more out of curiosity than conviction. He began by clearing the electrical bay behind the cockpit, working carefully through panels that had not been opened in decades. Several circuit breakers, he noticed, had been pulled out manually before the aircraft ever came to rest, a deliberate action rather than damage from the elements. It suggested the pilot had intentionally isolated a failing system during the emergency, choosing which circuits to keep alive and which to cut. On one of the panels, faint but unmistakable, someone had written 2 initials in grease pencil. The letters D and C. Mason went very still when he saw them. That was exactly how his father, David Carter, used to mark every electrical panel he inspected during his years in the trade. He said nothing to Charlotte about it that afternoon, though the initials stayed with him long after he left the hangar. Mason rigged an external power source the following morning, careful not to attempt starting the engines, since his only goal was to test the electrical and avionics systems still wired into the airframe. Charlotte stood outside the open cabin door, arms folded against the cold, watching him work through the tangle of cables with a patience that surprised her. One by one, old warning lights along the instrument panel blinked to life, dim at first and then steadier as the connection settled. Mason moved to the communication panel and tried the radio, expecting nothing, since equipment left dormant that long rarely survived. Nothing happened on the first attempt, and he nearly wrote it off as dead weight worth removing before the teardown. Tracing the wiring further, he found a secondary power line that had been disconnected from the main panel, tucked out of sight behind an access plate. He reconnected it, uncertain what, if anything, it would change. A low static hiss rose from the speaker, faint but unmistakable, and the radio's dial lit amber for the first time in 20 years. Charlotte stepped closer without meaning to, drawn by the sound. Mason turned the frequency knob slowly, half expecting only noise, and instead the speaker cracked with a distorted fragment of a voice, choked by decades of interference. It said his name. He froze completely, hand still on the dial, the cold suddenly forgotten. A long stretch of static followed, and then the voice returned, clearer this time, warning him not to let anyone find the recorder. Charlotte asked if someone was transmitting to them right now, her voice tight with disbelief. Mason checked the frequency again and confirmed it was not even a band currently in use by any station nearby. He pulled the radio housing apart to understand what he was hearing, and behind the faceplate he found a small custom recording module wired directly into the transmission circuit, clearly added by someone who understood the system intimately. It was not receiving anything. It was playing back the last message ever recorded into its memory, triggered automatically the moment power returned to the unit. Mason played the recording again, listening more carefully this time, and realized he had misheard the first word entirely. It was not his first name at all. It was his last name, spoken the way only one person in his life had ever said it. He recognized the voice immediately, though it took him a moment to accept what his ears were telling him, because the man speaking through that radio, David Carter, had been dead for 8 years. Charlotte watched the color drain from his face and asked if he was all right, though the answer was written plainly enough on his features. Mason did not explain right away. He simply replayed the message a third time, listening past the words themselves for anything, in the tone that might tell him whether his father had been afraid when he recorded it. The voice was steady, almost businesslike, the same measured cadence Mason remembered from childhood, whenever David explained how something mechanical worked. That steadiness unsettled him more than panic would have, because it meant his father had recorded this message with full intention, fully aware of what he was choosing to leave behind and for whom. Mason sat down on the cold cabin floor, radio still humming faintly beside him, and for several minutes neither he nor Charlotte spoke at all, the silence between them filled only by the low static drifting from the speaker. Mason stood in the cold cabin, long after the recording fell silent, unable to reconcile what he had just heard with anything he thought he knew about his father. As far as he understood growing up, David Carter had never once claimed to be connected to this disappearance, and the two of them had barely spoken about the man's career at all. Charlotte, sensing there was more to uncover, arranged for the company's archive team to pull every old personnel file connected to the wreck that night. Buried in a box of contractor records, they found a report confirming that David Carter had been hired as a contract avionics inspector for this exact aircraft, registration N417HC, only 3 days before its final flight. Stamped across the top of his findings, in faded red ink, was a single line that stopped Mason cold. It read that the inspection had been marked incomplete and the technician removed from the project. Mason thought back to a stretch of his childhood when his father abruptly lost work and never explained why, a silence that had shaped how Mason viewed him for years afterward. He had always assumed his father simply failed at something. One more disappointment in a string of ordinary setbacks that never got discussed at the dinner table. The truth sitting in front of him now suggested something else entirely, something deliberate rather than accidental. Charlotte, working through the same stack of documents, found her own family's name buried in the maintenance history. Logan Hayes, her late father, was listed as the executive overseeing the subcontractor responsible for part of the aircraft's avionics system at the time. The connection unsettled her more than she expected. She began to wonder whether Hayes Aeronautics, the company her father built and the one she now ran, had played some role in what happened to this plane 20 years ago. Jackson called again that evening, and this time his tone had shifted noticeably once he learned the radio had actually powered on. He insisted that no one touch the aircraft again until legal counsel reviewed the situation, citing corporate liability and outdated insurance language Charlotte had never heard him mention before. She pressed him on why an old radio playing static should concern a company lawyer at all, and he offered only vague reassurances that did nothing to explain his urgency. Mason watched her expression change as she listened, and when the call ended, neither of them needed to say the obvious thing out loud. Someone with real influence over this company was afraid of what they might find next, and that fear alone told them they were finally asking the right questions. The next morning, Mason and Charlotte located the compartment where the flight data recorder should have been mounted, tucked into the tail section behind a reinforced access panel. The compartment was empty, and the mounting bolts had clearly been removed from the inside, rather than torn loose by any impact. That detail mattered more than almost anything else they had found so far. Snow and time could crush metal, but they could not unscrew a bolt with careful, deliberate hands. Someone had opened that panel and taken the recorder out after the aircraft came to rest, which meant that person had survived the landing and walked away from the wreck under their own power. Official records, however, told a very different story, one in which 2 pilots and a test engineer had all been listed as missing and presumed lost in the crash. Mason searched the cabin more thoroughly, checking for anything that might contradict what the empty compartment implied, but there was nothing to find. No remains, no evidence of a fire, severe enough to have consumed a body without a trace, nothing to suggest anyone had died inside that aircraft at all. Taken together with the missing recorder, the evidence pointed toward one uncomfortable conclusion: that everyone aboard had left the plane alive after it landed. Charlotte asked the obvious question, why none of them had ever come back or come forward in 20 years. Mason offered the only explanation that made sense to him, that perhaps they never wanted anyone to know they had survived at all. While searching the cargo hold, Mason noticed a panel that had clearly been removed and reinstalled at some point, its screws slightly mismatched from the ones surrounding it. Behind that panel, he found a folded paper map, brittle with age, but still legible enough to read. A location roughly 4 miles from the wreck site had been circled in pencil, and beside the circle someone had written 3 letters and a single word, O.P., followed by the word tower. Mason and Charlotte Cross referenced the old airport staff roster from that era and found a name matching those initials almost immediately. Owen Parker had worked as the air traffic controller on duty the night the aircraft disappeared. And unlike everyone else connected to this story, he was still alive. Mason and Charlotte drove out to Owen Parker's home on the edge of town, a modest house surrounded by spruce trees and a driveway that had not seen a plow in days. Owen answered the door but refused to talk at first, insisting the matter had been settled decades ago and belonged in the past where it was. It was only when Mason mentioned the name David Carter that something shifted in the older man's expression, a flicker of recognition mixed with something closer to relief. He invited them inside, poured 3 cups of coffee nobody touched, and finally told them what he had carried alone for 20 years. On the night the aircraft vanished, the flight crew had radioed the tower reporting a severe electrical failure mid-flight. A control unit installed on the plane did not match the specifications listed in its maintenance file, and David Carter had flagged that exact discrepancy before the flight ever left the ground, only to have his report dismissed. During the test flight, the mismatched unit overheated and began failing outright, forcing the crew to turn back toward the airport in worsening weather. A sudden whiteout made the runway impossible to see, and with fuel and options running low, Owen guided the pilots toward a flat stretch of open ground, a few miles short of the field instead. Against every likely outcome, the landing succeeded, and all 3 people aboard walked away from an aircraft that should have killed them. One of them carried the flight data recorder off the plane before anyone else arrived, a decision that made little sense to Owen at the time, and made a great deal more sense now. David Carter had not been aboard that flight, but he met the survivors shortly afterward and helped them extract data directly from the recorder before it disappeared for good. David intended to hand that evidence over to federal investigators, certain it would prove the crew had done nothing wrong. Before he could follow through, an attorney representing a large insurance firm arrived and quietly resolved the matter behind closed doors, and Owen never learned exactly what was promised or paid to make the case disappear so completely. All he remembered clearly was one thing David said to him near the end of that conversation, a line that had stayed with him for 20 years without ever fully understanding its meaning. David told him that if the company ever managed to get its hands on that recorder, he intended to leave something behind that they could never take away. That something, Owen now realized, was the recording waiting silently inside a radio buried under snow for 2 decades. Owen admitted he had thought about that conversation countless times over the years, replaying it whenever news of a plane crash came across the television, wondering if he had somehow failed the crew he guided down that night. He had never told anyone at the airport what really happened, partly out of fear for his own job, and partly because no official investigator had ever asked him a question specific enough to require the truth. Mason asked gently why he had kept quiet for so long, not as an accusation but out of genuine curiosity about a man who had clearly carried this weight alone. Owen said simply that once the case was closed and the insurance settlement went through, nobody in a position of authority seemed interested in reopening it, and a retired controller with no evidence of his own had little standing to insist otherwise. Charlotte thanked him for finally speaking, and as they stood to leave, Owen added one more detail he had almost forgotten, that David Carter had asked him, before parting ways that night, never to reveal the exact wording of the message hidden in the radio unless the right person came looking for it. Charlotte returned to the office that night and went straight to a storage room, holding her father's personal files, records that had never been digitized or reviewed since his passing. Near the bottom of a box marked with a year she recognized instantly, she found a letter in Logan Hayes's handwriting that had apparently never been sent to anyone. In it, her father admitted that the company had once installed an unapproved electrical control unit on an aircraft under financial pressure, choosing cost over caution in a decision he clearly regretted. The order to make that substitution had not come from Logan himself but from Jackson Reed, who had pushed the decision through despite warnings from at least one outside inspector. Logan had gone along with covering it up after the fact, convinced at the time that exposing the failure would bankrupt the company and cost hundreds of employees their jobs. The letter revealed that Logan's silence had not been permanent, even if it came far too late to matter. At some point, afterward, he reached out to David Carter directly and quietly began helping him gather proof of what had actually happened, hoping to correct a mistake he could no longer live with in good conscience. Despite their efforts, neither man ever located the flight recorder itself, and Logan came to believe one of the survivors had hidden it somewhere it would never be found. Reading her father's own words, Charlotte felt the weight of two conflicting instincts pulling against each other. Releasing this letter publicly would tarnish her father's name and expose Hayes Aeronautics to lawsuits the company could not easily absorb, even now. Jackson called again the following morning, more insistent than before, pressuring Charlotte to authorize the immediate destruction of the wreck before the story could spread any further. She refused outright, and in that refusal, she made a decision that would define the rest of this investigation far more than any single piece of evidence had. She chose the truth over protecting a family name that, as it turned out, had already been compromised long before she inherited it. Mason noticed the shift in her almost immediately, a new steadiness in how she carried herself once the decision was made. Nothing about their growing trust was loud or dramatic. No declarations, no sudden confessions. Only two people who had started this investigation as strangers and were slowly becoming something closer to allies who genuinely relied on one another. Mason drove back out to the hangar that night to look through the map again, hoping a closer study of the marked location might reveal something he had missed earlier. As he approached, he noticed fresh tire tracks cutting through the snow, tracks that had not been there when he left the site that afternoon. Farther ahead, the beam of an excavator's headlights swept across the wreck, already positioning itself to tear into the fuselage. A demolition order had gone out through the company's internal system that evening, authorized under an account Mason did not recognize. He called Charlotte immediately, and she confirmed within seconds that she had signed no such order and had no idea it had been issued at all. Jackson still held old administrative credentials from his years running operations, credentials that apparently no one had bothered to revoke. Mason reached the excavator and managed to shut it down before the bucket made contact with the tail section, buying precious minutes before anyone else arrived. Jackson pulled up moments later, stepping out into the cold without any further pretense of concern or cooperation. He told Mason plainly that this matter had been closed 2 decades ago and did not need to be dug up again by anyone, least of all a contractor with no stake in the company's future. He argued, almost convincingly, that the cover-up had protected hundreds of jobs and kept the business alive through years it might not have otherwise survived. Mason did not let that argument stand unchallenged, telling him flatly that he had not protected anyone. He had simply decided who would carry the cost of his choices instead of him. In the middle of that exchange, Jackson revealed something Mason had not expected to hear from him directly. The flight recorder, he admitted, had never actually been aboard the aircraft when it went down, a detail Jackson had spent 20 years quietly trying to confirm for himself without success. The moment he said it, Mason thought back to the map hidden in the cargo hold and the location circled beside Owen Parker's initials. That circled point had never matched the actual coordinates of the control tower at all, sitting instead nearly 200 meters off to one side. David had chosen the word tower deliberately, Mason realized, using it as a decoy for anyone who might one day find the map without understanding what it truly pointed toward. Mason and Charlotte followed the map to the true location the next day. An overgrown foundation where an emergency radio relay station had once stood before it was decommissioned and forgotten. The recent thaw had loosened enough frozen ground for them to see a metal case partially exposed beneath the collapsed floor, deliberately buried rather than lost by accident. Inside, they found something different from what they had expected. Not the flight recorder itself, but its memory module, carefully removed from the housing and hidden separately from the device it belonged to. Beside it sat a reel of magnetic tape, wrapped in cloth, and remarkably well preserved, given how many winters had passed over it undisturbed. When they played the tape back, David Carter's voice filled the small space between them, steady, despite everything he must have known was at stake when he recorded it. He explained that he had not released the evidence immediately because one of the surviving pilots was actively being threatened at the time, and going public too soon could have put that person in real danger. Instead, he had quietly sent copies of the recovered data to Logan Hayes, trusting a man he believed still had enough conscience left to eventually make things right. David admitted on the tape that he came to doubt Logan would ever find the courage to release it, a doubt that, as they now knew, had been at least partly justified. What moved Mason most was not the conspiracy laid bare across those files, but the final words his father left behind for whoever might one day find them. David said that, if his son ever discovered this story, he hoped Mason would understand that silence born from fear, and silence born from trying to protect someone, can look identical from the outside, even though they are not the same thing at all. He added that no matter how long it took, the truth still had to be spoken eventually, because burying it only delayed the reckoning rather than preventing it. Standing in that collapsed foundation with his father's voice fading out around him, Mason finally understood a man he had spent years believing was simply weak, and realized instead that David Carter had been carrying a burden no one around him had ever known existed. Charlotte gave him a few minutes alone before speaking again, sensing that this discovery belonged to Mason in a way the rest of the investigation never had. When she finally asked what he wanted to do with the data now that they had it, Mason answered without hesitation, telling her the only choice that made sense was to hand everything over to the proper investigators and let the truth stand on its own. He gathered the memory module and the tape carefully, wrapping them the way his father once wrapped fragile instruments before transporting them across long distances. Walking back toward the truck, Mason found himself thinking not about Jackson or the company or even the survivors whose lives had been quietly rewritten by a settlement decades earlier. He thought instead about a much smaller memory, his father teaching him as a boy to always check a connection twice before trusting that it would hold, a lesson that suddenly felt like it had been about far more than wiring all along. Charlotte called an emergency meeting of the board within days of recovering the tape, aware that whatever she decided now would define the company far more than any quarterly report ever could. Jackson made one final attempt to contain the situation, proposing quietly that the matter stay buried permanently, that Mason be compensated generously for his silence, and that the wreck simply disappear from company property without further discussion. He framed it as protecting the business that so many people still depended on for their livelihoods, the same argument he had used for 20 years to justify everything that came before it. Charlotte listened to the entire proposal without interrupting, and then she refused it without hesitation or apology. She turned the recovered data, along with her father's unsent letter, over to federal aviation investigators and an independent legal team with no ties to the company's leadership. Jackson was suspended from his position within the week, pending a formal inquiry that moved faster than anyone at Hayes Aeronautics had expected. The subsequent investigation confirmed everything the tape and the letter had suggested, that David Carter's original report identifying the faulty control unit, had been accurate from the very beginning. His findings had been deliberately stripped from the official maintenance record before the test flight was ever cleared to proceed. Investigators also confirmed that none of the flight crew had died in the incident at all, contrary to what the case file had claimed for 2 decades. 2 of the 3 survivors, it turned out, had changed their identities under a legal settlement, tied to the insurance dispute that followed the landing, while the 3rd had passed away naturally, several years later, under an assumed name. The case never became the kind of sprawling conspiracy that headlines tend to exaggerate into something larger than life. It was, in the end, a much smaller and more familiar story, one shaped by greed, financial pressure, corporate insurance interests, and a series of ordinary people who each chose silence when the truth would have cost them something real. David Carter's professional reputation, tarnished quietly for 20 years by a single dismissive stamp on a report, was fully restored once the investigation concluded, and his name finally appeared where it always should have, attached to the truth he had tried to tell from the very beginning. Several months passed before the wreck was fully restored, though not for flight, since Charlotte had never intended to return it to service once the investigation concluded. Instead, she chose to place the aircraft at the center of a new training facility Hayes Aeronautics was building, a permanent fixture rather than a piece of history to be quietly forgotten. A small plaque was mounted near the entrance to the display, its wording simple and deliberately understated for a story that could easily have been told with far more drama. It read that safety begins the moment someone refuses to ignore what does not look right, a line Charlotte insisted on keeping short rather than turning the moment into a tribute to herself. Her own name appeared nowhere on the plaque, and she made certain of that personally before it went up. David Carter's name, by contrast, was included in a small display case nearby, listed among engineers who had once tried to report safety failures, only to be ignored or overruled by people with more authority than judgment. Mason was invited to lead a new independent safety review program the company was establishing, built specifically to prevent the kind of quiet dismissal that had buried his father's original report for 2 decades. He turned down the management title that came attached to the offer at first, uneasy about stepping into a role that felt too far removed from the hands-on work he actually valued. Charlotte considered his hesitation for a moment, and then offered him a simpler alternative, telling him that if the title bothered him that much, he did not have to work for her at all. Mason looked at her, waiting for the rest of it, and she corrected herself without missing a beat, telling him instead that he could work alongside her. That distinction mattered enough to him that he finally agreed. One evening after the training facility had closed for the day, Mason stayed behind, standing quietly beside the old aircraft under the dim overhead lights of the hangar. Charlotte found him there and brought 2 cups of coffee with her, setting one down beside him without a word before taking her place at his side. There was no board meeting waiting on either of them anymore, no hidden files left to uncover, no one left chasing evidence they were desperate to keep buried. She asked him, half joking, whether he ever really believed the radio had been calling out to him that first night. Mason thought about it honestly before answering, and told her no, he did not believe that, not literally. He added, after a pause, that his father had probably known one day some stubborn Carter would eventually be the one to switch that radio back on. Charlotte laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that had been rare between them during the weeks of tension leading up to this quiet evening. They walked out of the hangar together, and for the first time since they had met, their conversation had nothing to do with the company, the wreck, or anything either of them needed to prove to the other. Charlotte asked if he wanted to get dinner, and Mason checked his watch out of habit before answering. He told her he needed to make one call home first, and stepped a short distance away to check in, learning that his daughter was safely with her grandmother for the evening, and that everything there was fine. When he returned, Charlotte was still waiting exactly where he had left her, unbothered by the cold or the short delay. He asked if she still wanted that dinner, and she answered dryly that she had already been standing outside in Alaska for several minutes now, so he could decide what he thought that meant. Mason smiled, and the two of them walked toward the parking lot together, without any further discussion needed. There was no dramatic kiss, no rushed declaration, nothing overstated about the moment at all, only the quiet, steady start of something neither of them felt the need to rush. Behind them, the old aircraft sat still beneath the hangar lights, its radio finally silent after 20 long years. This time, though, it had nothing left to hide. What stayed with Mason long after that winter was not the mystery itself, but the quiet lesson buried inside it, that a small, overlooked detail can carry more weight than an entire company's official story. His father never sought recognition for what he tried to do 20 years earlier, and in the end, he did not need it, because the truth found its way out through patience rather than proof alone. Charlotte learned something similar, that protecting a name sometimes means letting it be corrected, rather than defended at any cost. If this story ever made you look twice at the quiet people around you, the ones who notice what others overlook, then it did what it was meant to do. Some truths are not shouted. They simply wait for someone patient enough to listen.